In my humble opinion, there's absolutely nothing wrong with devoting a small portion of your overall long-term portfolio into super high-yielding ETFs or even stocks for that matter. And by doing this specifically, you could raise your overall monthly dividend income substantially with much less money invested comparing if you were to invest into other things. Now in this video, we're going to talk about one of my favorite ultra high-yielding ETFs that I personally have been buying for over a year now. The ETF being SVOL or the Simplified Volatility Premium ETF. We're going to go over exactly what this ETF is, exactly how it works, and then later on in this video, I'm going to share with you exactly how much money an investor would need to invest into an ETF like this that yields north of 16% in order to completely retire free and clear off of dividends. So if you're a dividend investor and are somewhat interested in investing into super high yielding ETFs and want cash flow a lot faster, make sure to drop a like down below, stick around, and let's get right into this one. Real quick, for those that haven't already, make sure to go to the first link in my description and grab my new dividend investing ebook where I share exactly how I went from $0 invested to now earning over $6,000 on a monthly basis and over $1 million invested in the markets. Along with the ebook, you're also going to receive my custom dividend tracker where you can track your dividend progress on an ongoing basis and reach your dividend investing goals. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. Now, before we go over and dig a little bit deeper into SVOL, learn exactly what this ETF is, how it works, and what it has to offer. As of right now, throughout all my portfolios, I currently have around 210 shares of it at an average cost of around $22 per share. Now, compared to the rest of my portfolio, this is a very small position, and this is because of my specific investing strategy. I don't want to have my portfolio extremely high yield. I want there to be a good mix of high yield and growth in my portfolio. But digging right into it, SVOL or the Simplified Volatility Premium ETF says it seeks to provide the investment results before fees and expenses that correspond to approximately 1/5 to 3/10 or the inverse of the performance of the CBOE Volatility Index or the VIX. Short-term futures index while also seeking to mitigate extreme volatility. Now, the fund's short VIX positions provides investors an optimized exposure for monetizing premium, and this is inside the VIX future markets. A modest option overlay budget is then deployed into VIX call options in case anything crazy happens within the time frame. Now, some more important facts about SVOL: the gross expense ratio is pretty pricey, and that's because this ETF is actively managed and it's pretty complicated. And although a 1.16% gross expense ratio is very high, maybe one of the highest expense ratios you're going to see, I promise you when you see this ETF's performance, it might all be worth it. Total assets, this is pretty shocking that SVOL is coming up on $1 billion of total assets. And I say this is shocking because when I first started buying SVOL personally, this ETF was much smaller in maybe the 200 million range. Now the distribution yield as of recent, 15.96%. So we're talking around 16% yield for an ETF that has been very consistent, at least over the long term. The distribution is also monthly, so again, this is going to be perfect, or could be perfect potentially, for investors that are looking to potentially replace some of their active income and use dividends from SVOL to pay for things like bills. The ETF has only been around since about May 2021, so it is relatively new, although we do have a few years of data to go off of. Now we're going to look through SVOL's chart here in a second and see how that has looked over the long term, but as far as distributions go, SVOL has a pretty steady cadence of paying around 30 cents per share per month, which it's done more or less over the last year or so. Now historically, SVOL has paid a little bit more, a little bit less, but it looks like the management, at least moving forward, unless something changes, is going to give investors like myself, and maybe like some of you guys, 30 cents per share per month, which is substantial considering one share of SVOL costs just over $22. Now, even though SVOL seems like the perfect higher yielding ETF so far, and although it does check off a lot of boxes, especially if that's what you're looking for, this ETF is far from perfect. It is actually down as far as price return goes year to date, which again isn't that big of a deal because again, when you're getting that massive yield, no one's going to cry over a chart trading sideways, but again, compared to the rest of the market, there have been some massive gains throughout this year. And on top of that, over the max time frame, this ETF is actually down as far as price return goes, down 11.81%, although ever since around 2022, SVOL has stabilized and traded sideways, if not up a little bit. And maybe the best way to represent exactly how this ETF has performed, let's look at some total return stats. If you were to have invested $10,000 into SVOL when this ETF first came out, that $10,000 would now be worth around $14,000, or an average annual total return of around 11.23%, or a total return over 3.15 years of 39.8%. Now, throughout the market, there have been stocks and ETFs that have performed better and a lot that have performed worse, but overall, a steady 11%, getting paid dividends monthly. this ETF definitely has my attention. Now, to try to figure out the final question, how much SVOL would an investor need to potentially retire completely free and clear off the dividend? And of course, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with SVOL's dividend in the future. Could it be cut? Could it be raised? Of course. But with that around 30 cents more or less that investors have been able to receive over the last 6+ months, let's just go off of that. Now also along with that, expenses are going to be much different depending on where you live, if you're single, if you're married, if you have kids. But just for this video's example, it says the average monthly expenses for one person can vary, but the average single person spends about $3,405 per month. Housing tends to consume the large portion of the monthly income, etc., etc. So for this video's sake, let's go off of $3,400 or $3,500 of expenses per month and see how much SVOL an investor would need to buy. Now the math is pretty simple because SVOL pays around 30 cents more or less per share per month, and because we just found out the average person needs at least around $3,500 to pay for all their expenses. That means that if we divided $3,500 by 30 cents, an investor would need to purchase 11,667 shares of SVOL to completely retire in theory and pay all their expenses with that massive juicy dividend. Now, because SVOL is currently trading around $22.70, this means an investor would in theory need to invest around $264,000 more or less in order to have that $3,500 of income coming in from cash flow from the dividends. Now, like we talked about towards the beginning of this video, I shared that at least with my investing strategy and what I'm looking for long term as far as building out a portfolio, I personally never would invest a substantial portion of my overall portfolio into something like SVOL or any other alternative style investment. And this is just because I really want to invest into things that have substantially grown over time and have a lot of history of doing so. Different things like SCHD, for example, that not only pays a nice decent dividend per quarter, but also has been paying more and more per quarter over the long term. But throughout my portfolio, as you can see, I do have different alternative style investments, some of them being pretty high yield because cash flow is still very, very important to me, specifically as a dividend investor that favors growth but also favors cash. But with my current 210 shares of SVOL that I currently have in my long-term portfolio, I'm going to keep buying more and more shares over time, probably up until I get to maybe 500 or so shares, but I'm in no rush to grab more shares as of right now, just a few shares here and there. Now looking at all of SVOL's dividends paid so far, since the ETF's inception, over the last years the dividend has went down a tad on a monthly basis, but overall I still would not consider SVOL by any means a yield trap. So much so to the point that if an investor was to ask me, for example, what is my number one buy and hold ETF that's say above 10, 12, 15% starting dividend yield, I would simply respond with SVOL. And although this ETF is not necessarily perfect by any means, it's definitely an ETF to look into. But now lastly, maybe most importantly, I want to hear from you guys down below when it comes to SVOL and when it comes to your investing strategy. Is SVOL ETF an ETF that you would consider investing into? And if you hold it as of right now, how many shares do you have? Let us know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like on it and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.